Well, Professor Hughes needs no introduction, but let me just briefly give you a few key pieces of information. John Hughes, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, came to BYU's Department of Communications after being editor of the Deseret Morning News in Salt Lake City from 1997 to 2006. Professor Hughes is a former editor of the Christian Science Monitor, where he began as a correspondent in the Far East and in Africa. He writes a nationally syndicated column in the Christian Science Monitor and has written 4 books, the most recent being his autobiography titled From Paperboy to Pulitzer, A Newsman's Journey. John Hughes also served as U.S. Assistant Secretary of State and as Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations, and he has chaired presidential and congressional commissions on international broadcasting. He was a Newsman Fellow at Harvard, and he won the Pulitzer Prize for his coverage of Indonesia and the Overseas Press Club Award for an investigation into the international narcotics traffic. He is a former president of the American Society of Newspaper Editors. Born in Wales and educated in England, he and his wife Peggy, a BYU alumna, have 3 children and 7 grandchildren. We always enjoy hearing from Professor Hughes, but on the publishing of his autobiography, we thought it was a very special occasion. Please join me in welcoming Professor John Hughes.
Thank you, Corey. Thank you very much for that generous introduction. I'm a little embarrassed by the title of this book, Paperboy to Pulitzer, and you have to blame it on my grown-up son, who's a marketing guy. And when he knew I was writing, I really started this book to leave it for my children and my grandchildren, who didn't know why I wasn't there many times because I was in foreign countries, and what exactly I was doing. But my marketing guy's son said, didn't you deliver newspapers during World War II when you were a teenager in London? And I said, yes, I did. And he said, well, then there's the title of the book, Paperboy to Pulitzer. And so the book has really sort of turned into a kind of a love story, my love story about journalism, because I think, especially for those of my journalism students here, I'll reiterate, they already know that I find it to be a fascinating, magical profession that means hardly ever having a dull day, because everything is new every day. And I just cannot believe over the years that I actually got paid for. I got paid to do the things I did, to visit the countries I did, and to meet presidents and prime ministers and mass murderers and villains and all kinds of interesting people, including a number over the years of very brave fighters for freedom in various countries I reported from. So that's how I got the title for the book. And actually, delivering newspapers in London as a teenager, I suppose, was my first blush with journalism, because in those days London had a huge number of dailies, powerful dailies, the Times, the Daily Express, the Daily Mail, the News Chronicle, the Daily Telegraph. If you were a highbrow, the Guardian. If you were a lowbrow, the Daily Mirror. If you as a newspaper delivery boy, if you got the wrong newspaper to the wrong greeter, you were in a lot of trouble, because this was their involvement with that newspaper, and it was a sort of insight of how people manage to get their news. I think my next step towards journalism was when I went to boys' school in England, and after 1 or 2 unfortunate experiments in the chemistry lab and the physics lab, my chemistry and physics lab professors or teachers said that they thought I had little prospect of a career in those fields. However, my English master said, I think you maybe can write, and you ought to go to the London School of Journalism when you get out of school. Well, I never did, because my dad, who'd been in World War II and had fought in North Africa for 3 years, when he came home, said, our family is emigrating to South Africa. So off we went to South Africa, and that's where I started in journalism, in a 50,000 circulation morning newspaper in Durban, South Africa. Spent some time there, went back to, learning the things that you do as a young journalist. Went back to London for a couple of years, worked there in news organizations, and then went back to South Africa to run a bureau in the state capital of my old newspaper. But I'd begun to write some freelance pieces for other newspapers in London, and I discovered the Christian Science Monitor, which, like the Deseret News, is owned by a church, a Christian Science church. And in its heyday, it was listed among the 10 best newspapers in the country, in the United States, and specialized in foreign coverage and national coverage. And I said, well, that's where I want to work. And so off I went to Boston, which was the headquarters of the Monitor, and got a job there. And as you do, you spend a couple of years working in that organization, in that location, before they sent me to Africa. And they said, we want you to be correspondent based in Cape Town, one of the most beautiful cities in the world. But I wasn't there very much. Based in Cape Town, but covering sub-Saharan Africa. And you usually went for 3 years, and then you go home for home leave, and then if you've done okay, you usually go back for another 3 years, or if you like where you're operating. So I had 6 years in Africa, and it was a time when when I arrived, almost all of Africa were colonial territories owned by the British or the French or the Portuguese or the Belgians. And by the time I left, starting with Kenya and then Ghana, they'd all become independent. South Africa, of course, was a different case, and I spent a lot of time in South Africa. South Africa was in the grip of apartheid. The black majority was run by a white minority. There was total segregation, separate entrances to buildings, separate seats in airplanes and trains, separate beaches, and so it went on. And the white regime was very cruel to the African majority. I was there at a time when foreign correspondents were not very welcome. The special branch of the white police force was very interested in everything we did, tried to block what we did. They monitored our phone calls. After I had a long conversation with one source that I was working with, I put the phone back, and a little while later picked up the phone, and my conversation with him was playing back to me over the phone, so we knew that we were being monitored. And if you went to see a black leader, or a white liberal for that matter, they would talk to you, if they were at a desk, they would talk to you with a towel or a sock stuffed in the mouthpiece of the telephone, so the conversation we were having could not be overheard by the special branch. I left before the violence began in South Africa. The wonderful man Nelson Mandela was in prison for 20-something years, all the time I was there. And every time I asked for permission to go see him in prison, it was refused. So I never met him during that time. There was an interesting aftermath, though. Years later, when he had been freed and he'd come out with this amazing speech of compassion and cooperation between whites and blacks, and was really a remarkable man. I found out that he had gone to the United States and he'd gone to Boston. And when he was in Boston, he said, I would like to be taken to the offices of the Christian Science Monitor. And they took him to the office of the Monitor and met the editors there. And he said, I wanted to come and thank you for what you did in coverage of South Africa, because the Christian Science Monitor was the only international paper they allowed me to read all the years I was in prison, and it encouraged me, kept me going, helped, his actual words were, helped sustain him. So that was kind of nice to know. After I had been 6 years in Africa, I went back to Boston. My then wife and I wanted to start a family. We wanted our children to be born in the United States. So I did 2 years back in the Boston office, with the knowledge that the Monitor wanted my next assignment to be in Moscow. I never went to Moscow as a full-time correspondent, but during the Cuban Missile Crisis, we didn't have anybody there, and they sent me over to try my fledgling Russian language. It was an interesting experience. I was a little taken back by the prospect of it was a Cuban Missile Crisis, and we were on the brink of war. And so I was always aware that I was in danger, which I thought would be rather unfair, of being killed by an American missile in Moscow if war broke out. But anyway, I survived. We had a new editor at the Monitor, and he said, you're headed for Moscow. And I said, as a new assignment. And I said, sure. And he said, you're looking forward to it? And I said, sure. And he said, how about the Far East? How about based in Hong Kong, every country between Japan and India? I said, I'll take that. That sounds wonderful. So off I went to Hong Kong, based there. And while I was in the Far East, there were probably 3 major stories that I most worked on. One was China. You couldn't get into China. It was totally closed. The American consulate had a huge office there, lots of people you could go talk to who were experts on various aspects of the Chinese economy. A big CIA operation, and you could also, you could work with them to an extent. Then you interviewed refugees coming across the border, find out what they had experienced. You listened to New China News Agency, which was all propaganda. And you listened to Radio Beijing, as it then was, which was also all propaganda. But it was an interesting place to try to cover. And every couple of months, I would send a cable to the foreign ministry in Beijing saying, I'm really this very, very reliable, open correspondent, and I just would like to come to China and report fairly on all the things you're doing there. Never got an answer back in 6 years. I used to send a similar cable to Hanoi, telling them what a fair journalist I was, and I thought it'd be wonderful for good relations if they let me come to North Vietnam. By contrast, they used to send a cable back sometimes, and it used to start off rather well. Thank you for your request, Mr. Hughes. And you thought, oh boy, maybe something's going to happen here. But then came the propaganda. But unfortunately, the running dogs of American imperialism are bombing our country, and we cannot, it would be unsafe for you to come at the present time. So I never got to North Vietnam. But occasionally they would put a few lines in the cable that came back to them that made a story, including when they first talked about their conditions for peace talks, which I got a page 1 story above the fold on that one. That was kind of interesting. Vietnam, although there was always another Monitor correspondent fully stationed in Saigon, I was the backup person, and I went to Vietnam about 20 times in 6 years, I guess. And one interesting session I had I was briefly back in the United States, and I was in the Washington Bureau of the Christian Science Monitor. And the call came in from the White House from an aide to President Johnson, Lyndon Johnson, who said, President Johnson understands you are here in the United States, and we know you've been writing about Vietnam, and could you possibly come over to talk to President Johnson? And I said, yes, of course I can. And over I went, and in my naivety, I thought, oh, perhaps President Johnson, understanding that I've been in Vietnam, wants a little sort of first-hand stuff from me. Well, that was a pipe dream. He wanted to talk to me about what he was doing in Vietnam, which he did for about 30 minutes non-stop. And it was at a time when Australia was a big supporter of the American cause in Vietnam, and Menzies, the Australian Prime Minister, was about to make a state visit to the United States, and he was going to be brought in by helicopter to the White House. So after about a half an hour, an aide came in and said, Mr. President, Menzies is on his way, you better come out. And Johnson said, yeah, and went on talking about Vietnam. And a second aide came in more agitated than the first and said, Mr. President, He's in his helicopter. The helicopter's approaching, and you could hear the 21-gun salute starting. And von Johnson, yeah, said, and went on talking. And then finally, a very, very desperate aide came in and said, Mr. President, he's just about to arrive. You've got to go out. So Johnson looked at me and said, want to come out and be with me, with Johnson, with Menzies? And I thought, the Secret Service, a strange figure appearing next to the President of the United States, and Menzies not knowing who it was. I said, no thanks, I think I won't do that. But it was very, very strange meeting with President Lyndon Johnson. China, Vietnam, the Tet Offensive. Tet Offensive was a big holiday season when all American soldiers were stood down and the Vietnamese soldiers were stood down, and everything was supposed to be quiet. And if you remember, that's the time that the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong attacked and swept through the lower part of the country and actually got into the American compound. And pictures were taken of them in the compound. I was in Hong Kong at the time. The only person the Monitor had in Saigon was a fairly older lady education editor who was not really a war correspondent. She was desperate to get out of Vietnam, and the Monitor was desperate for me to get into Vietnam. Well, ordinarily you could fly from Hong Kong to Saigon on Air Vietnam, but that was all shut down because Saigon was in flames. But I got a plane ride from Hong Kong to Bangkok, and there found about a dozen of my other friends and correspondents also trying to get back into Vietnam. And so we were beating up on the American embassy and said, you've got to get us there somehow. And they said, well, finally, so they said, all right, we got a plane. We have no idea whether they're going to shoot it down, but if you guys want to go on it, you can go. So we said, fine. So they said, we're sending a truck out to pick you guys up at the hotel. And about 12 of us climbed into this truck, which was driven by an Air Force sergeant. And we were pretty enthusiastic about the fact that we're getting back into Saigon for this big story. And he turned around and he looked at us as we were slapping each other on the back. And he said, you guys are going to try to get into Saigon? And we said, yeah. And he said, and there are people in Saigon who are trying to get out of Saigon. And we said, yeah. And he said, but you guys are trying to get into Saigon, right? And we said, yeah. And he said, boy, they must be paying you a lot of money. Anyway, we did get into Saigon. And what I wrote was that, for the Monitor, was that it was a very dramatic effort by the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese, but from a military point of view, it was ineffective. But those pictures of those guys in the American embassy compound in Saigon went over the world, including the United States. And so it was a kind of a fruitless exercise on the part of the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong. It was the turning point of the war because it had an impact on the American public. And that's exactly what that war was always about. It was always targeted at undermining American confidence in the feeling that they should go on. Then came Indonesia, which was a pretty big story, and it was very difficult to get into Indonesia, but I got a visa with the aid of a friend in the American embassy, and made my first visit. And on my first visit, actually, it was clear what was happening. Sukarno, who was the president of Indonesia and had given it nation status after it had been colonized by the Dutch, had a sort of honeymoon with the Russians, and that had fallen apart. And then he'd had a honeymoon with the Americans, and that had fallen apart. And he had shifted to the Chinese communists, and he was very in tight with China. So I got in, and there was a lot of demonstrations, and I was inside the American embassy with a young Indonesian guy I'd hired to get to report for me because I didn't speak the language. And the embassy was besieged by a mob. And then a phone call came in that the United States Library, United States Information Agency building, about half a mile away, was under attack. And I said, well, we got to get out of here. And the embassy was all buttoned down, and the Marine Guard said, no, we're not opening the gates. You can't do it. So we climbed over the fence. Nobody shot us because we were going out, not going in, and ran down a narrow road that led to the American installation. We met the mob that had attacked it and torn down the American flag and destroyed it, coming back towards us, and it was clear they were not friendly. And so my interpreter and I wedged ourselves in between a couple of cars against a wall, and it was a time for prayer, actually, and there was prayer. And I discovered afterwards that the mob saw me and said, "There's a white face. That's an American. Let's kill him." And then there'd been a little discussion with a couple of leaders of this pack who said, according to my interpreter, no, there are good Americans and there are bad Americans. But he could be a Russian. He may not be an American. But even if he is an American, he's not necessarily a bad American, so we shouldn't kill him. And where they went on their way. So that was my first introduction to Indonesia. Well, it went downhill after that. They burned other American installations. They cut the phones to American residences. They demonstrated all the time. They burned other American installations elsewhere in Indonesia. And it deteriorated, and it appeared that I met the Indonesian Communist Party had become the third largest communist party in the world after Russia and China. And they were intent on power, and I had a long interview with their leader, Mr. Aidit, in his headquarters building, which a year after had been destroyed, literally burned to the ground by the good guys. But the decision, things were going to be obviously on a odd status for a while, so I had to go cover the elections in the Philippines. I was in the Philippines. And then the Associated Press had a bulletin that there'd been a coup in Indonesia. 6 of the top generals had been murdered, and Sukarno had regained power. All of that was correct, except he hadn't regained power. He was kind of isolated by the military. Got a plane the next day to fly back to Indonesia. It was going to make a night landing. Flight got cancelled because General Suharto, who was not one of the generals killed, he'd been at the beach fishing with his son all night. Suharto had ringed the Air Force base and the civilian base with anti-aircraft guns because they didn't know what was going to happen. They were going to shoot down any plane that went. Anyway, eventually got in. And over a long period of time, saw what happened. The 6 generals had been murdered. A renegade unit of the army with the management of the Communist Party had taken them during the night, murdered some, took them all out to Halim Air Force Base. Air Force was more conducive to relations with China. And those who were still alive, they killed them, they tortured them, and they threw them down a well. Suharto comes back to town, takes up the command of the army, and then there's a long-drawn tussle between the army and the Communist Party. The army says we're going to have a purge. We will keep Sukarno in power because we kind of need him, but he's not going to have any power. We're going to restrict him, and we're going to clean up the country. So they swept through the para-commandos. And I knew Sawa Odi, the commander, quite well, and followed what they were doing, and he was very frank about it. They swept through the Long Island of Java, killing communists. Now, many people they killed were not communists because they were peasants who had a little card that said Partai Komunis Indonesia, Indonesian Communist Party. So the soldiers swept into a village, found them, and said, "You're a communist." And the peasant would say, "What do you mean I'm a communist?" And they would say, "Well, you remember this Communist Party?" And he would say, "Oh, you mean those guys who came around and offered us rice at a lower price than we had to pay to the banks?" "No, I'm not a communist. Off with their head, killed them. The highest estimate of those killed was about 1 million people. And I know that's wrong because I spent a lot of time afterwards investigating this. But I'm pretty sure that it was about at least 250,000 people got killed. And eventually, the army continued to restrict Sukarno, and eventually Suharto took over. So that was Indonesia. And I was back in Hong Kong early one morning, and Woody Edwards, the Associated Press bureau chief, called and said, oh, congratulations. And I said, on what? He said, you feel Pulitzer Prize. And I said, well, I didn't know that my newspaper had submitted a Pulitzer Prize, but they had, and I wasn't going to give it back. I mean, so that's what, that was my time in Asia. Went back to, after my 6 years in Asia, went back to be managing editor of the Monitor for about 7 months, and then I became editor for about 12 years. I suppose the highlight of that was the Watergate story and Mr. Nixon and all the rest of it. And I think the Monitor went pretty even-handedly down the middle without taking sides on that issue, but I had one pile of letters on my side of my desk deploring me by asking I'd resign from clubs I didn't belong to because of the terrible coverage we'd given. But then another pile which said, you know, right on, you really understand what's going on, it's great. So we thought we were doing something fairly straight down the middle. Eventually I bought a little weekly newspaper down on Cape Cod, and because I'd never owned a paper myself, and we started some other weeklies down there and had quite a little network. And then a guy called from Washington, Charlie Wick, who I did not know. But this was the Reagan administration. They had just come into office, and he was head of the United States Information Agency. And he said, I want you to come work for me. And I said, well, I can't do that because I got a business I've got here. No, I said, that's all right. He said, you come down and see me, bring your wife, bring the children, we'll talk. He thought he could talk my kids into liking the idea of going to Washington, which he couldn't actually. But anyway, I went to the USIA and enjoyed that. It was all three jobs that I had in the government were media related. And I concede that there is a debate about whether a journalist should ever join in the government. In my case, I was a Welshman born. I was a naturalized American citizen. I loved America. And I didn't feel that I should be hindered from serving my adopted country. But I have to level with you. I mean, there is a faction in journalism that you should never do that. You should never join government because you're going to the dark side and you can't come back and be, you know. So there certainly are two sides to that. I wasn't too long at the United States USIA before they had some troubles at the Voice of America and said, will you go down there and sort that out? And I did. I was director of the Voice of America. And then shortly after that, I got a call one day from George Shultz, who'd just become Secretary of State. And yes. Sure. I got this call from George Shultz, who'd just become Secretary of State. And he said, could I come down and talk to him? And I said, sure. And he said, I want you to be State Department spokesman and Assistant Secretary for Public Diplomacy, Public Affairs. And so I went. He was a man of the most extraordinary integrity and decency. Would that everybody who had ever served in Washington, and is serving in Washington, was as decent and extraordinary man as he was. He was not afraid to, if he made a mistake, he was not afraid to make it public and correct it. And he was very fair. He would, sometimes he'd have a few of us in, I'd be there talking about the press. If there was some new overture in diplomacy, he'd say, well, you know, what's the reaction going to be in the press? And I'd tell him, and then he would have the guy from the legislature. What do you think how the legislature is going to react? And maybe a guy from the area, how the people in the area are going to react. And then at the end, after we'd all given us our views, he would say, thank you, gentlemen. Now, what is the right thing to do? That is a quality that I really prized. I had a good relationship with him when I said, tell me how you want to operate. What is your feeling about what access I would have? He said, well, there are things you won't be able to talk about, but you can't know what you can't talk about unless you know everything. And so I sat in on his meetings with different various people. I read his classified cables, and it served me very well. Less fortunate was my colleague Larry Speaks, who was the White House spokesman, who was asked one night by a CBS correspondent, I think it was, whether it was true that the United States was going to invade a country in Central America the next day. And Larry went to Admiral Poindexter, who was the chief of the White House operation other than the president, and Admiral Poindexter said, "No truth in it, no truth in it." And Larry went back to the television network and said, "No, there's nothing happening." Schultz had told me that we were going to invade Grenada the next day. So my neck was saved with my press for colleagues, but poor Larry was kind of finished. So I really was very fortunate in having Schultz as my boss, who really understood how that should work. I also had pretty good relations with the correspondents covering the State Department, and I did the 11 o'clock briefing, which you were talking to the TV cameras, then you're talking to the wire service, and then you're talking to the New York Times and the Washington Post, because they all want different angles on the story. But most of the real work was done, really, by phone in the afternoon, talking to correspondents that you knew and you could trust, and who knew you and could trust you. And Bernie Kalb, who was a good friend of mine, and we traveled together in Asia. He was previously with the New York Times. He was with the network. Called me one day and he said, understand that the bad guys in Lebanon have a CIA officer. And I said, Bernie, I'll talk to you only off the record on that. And he said, no, don't want to talk to you off the record, because if it's off the record, I can't use it. So I said, well, you go back to your network and see what they say. So he went to his network, and they came back and said, okay, deal. And I said, well, they do have a CIA officer, but he's actually the CIA station chief. I mean, he's a top guy, and we don't know whether they know he's a CIA guy at all. And if you guys went with this, you would kill him. Never ever did they touch that story. That was a very wonderful relationship that you could have with these organizations. Unfortunately, the bad guys did find out. They tortured him. They did find out he was the CIA station chief, and they hanged him. But nevertheless, the newspapers had not broken their agreement. How are we doing for time? Are we okay? A little bit more? I went about 50 countries with Schultz on various travels, and admired him tremendously. The most interesting story we had involving the press was the shooting down of the Korean airliner 007, flying from I think somewhere in the western United States to Korea, and they drifted a little bit over the Kamchatka Peninsula, which was Russian territory. And I'd gone to work one morning, and my secretary said, "Secretary needs you right away," with a big flap. I went up, and Schultz was talking with Larry Eagleberg, who was the undersecretary, and they were furious, because I said, so-and-so shot that plane down, and the conversation went on about how we were going to respond to it, and so forth and so on. And I heard Larry Eagleberg say something about, yeah, we know they did it because of the tapes. And I said, what tapes? And Larry said, oh, you can't do anything with the tapes, because these were tapes that we were making in a secret location in a country that didn't know we were making them. And so you can't touch those tapes. And I said, well, that's the key to the story. What are they the tapes of? They said, oh, they're the tapes of the fighter pilots talking to each other as they attacked, and talking to their ground controller, and so on and so on. I said, we've got to have those tapes. And he said, no, you can't have those tapes because we'll be in trouble with the country where we're doing it, and the Russians are going to change all their codes for their fighter pilots. And I said, well, that's the key to it. And bless his heart, with a bad grace, Larry said, oh, all right, we got to get the tapes. And we got the tapes, and we translated them, and we showed them at the United Nations in front of the Security Council with speakers all around, and with the translation into English on huge screens. And you heard the lead pilot say, I have the target in sight. And then he was talking to his ground controller, and he said, I can see the lights flashing, which means they knew it was a commercial airliner. They put out a story afterwards that there would have been in the United States a reconnaissance plane, and they shot it down by accident. But I got news for you: reconnaissance planes don't usually fly with flashing lights. So anyway, I can see them. I can see the lights flashing. Do I have authority to shoot? Yes, you have authority to shoot. Missile is gone. The target is destroyed. And that was later, and of course, it was a huge, when we showed all this stuff at the United Nations, it was a huge black eye for the Russians, and they said, later they said, it was the greatest public diplomacy coup of the Cold War. So anyway, there were some interesting things that we could do. It was not all serious stuff. We were coming back we'd been to Mrs. Gandhi's funeral, and we were coming back on a plane, and the Time magazine, we'd gone to tea with Mrs. Thatcher afterwards, and Dennis, her husband, was sort of in the background and not allowed in the room we were in, and very much in the background. And when we were going back on the plane, and the Time magazine reporter in the back of the plane said to me, John, we're doing a profile on Mrs. Thatcher, and I need a quote from the secretary. So I went into the secretary's cabin with Ray Seitz, was his executive assistant. It was the end of the day. He had his tie down. It was relaxed. He'd had a drink. He was sort of in playful mood. And I said, well, we need this quote from you about Mrs. Thatcher. And he said, how about, I'd hate for Dennis to be in trouble if he didn't have dinner ready when she got home at night. And I said, that's great, that's wonderful. And he said, no, you can't say that. And bless his heart, Ray Seitz said, yes, Mr. Secretary, it's a great line. It's very human. So we gave that to the Time magazine guys, and they ran it, and it was fine. So there were some fun moments. I probably should stop there and take some questions, if there are any.
Tough questions. We'd ask you to come up to the microphone. If you're a student, tell us your name and what you're studying. Otherwise, just tell us your name. And as you're making your way up in the mad rush, because we always know the first question is always the best, right? John, there was something that you'd written in the Christian Science Monitor, one of your columns, about how you said the wise consumer of news on the internet should rely on a trusted source that provides proven accuracy and thoughtful explanation and interpretation. At the Kennedy Center, we provide free copies of the New York Times. We believe in an informed citizenry and student body, and we believe in that. What advice would you have for students about the plethora, the almost unimaginable number of sources for information, and how can we balance that? How can we find those thoughtful explanations? How should we be consumers of the news?
Well, thoughtfully, very carefully, I think. As we all know, we're moving out. The print newspaper is in decline, and we have the web, which is wonderful. But the problem about the web is anybody can get on it and publish truth or fiction. And we've had some notable crises of false information going all around the world, and then having to be recalled. And then there's always a question whether the people who heard the first story ever get the correction, and so forth and so on. So what I tell my students, some of whom are here, is what coup it is that you guys, with your standards and ethics, are going out into this world to make sure that what is published is accurate and truthful. And if for some reason it's wrong, it's speedily corrected. But I think you've just got to I think you've got to choose your source and determine what is credible. And it's increasingly difficult when the news entities are certainly accused and maybe indeed drifting in that direction of being partisan. For example, you're fairly sure that Fox is to the right of the news. You're certain that MSNBC is to the left of the news. CNN, sort of in the middle, and there you go. Wall Street Journal is thought to be a newspaper of the right. New York Times is often accused of being a paper of the left. I don't think that at the New York Times there is an inner circle which is announcing to reporters, you will write this in a way that supports the current president of the United States. I don't think it works like that. But a retiring ombudsman about 6 months ago, the ombudsman they have, people can write in and ask questions and correct stories, and he's independent. He's not independent. He's not obliged to report to the editor. But he wrote an interesting column which he said, I do not think that there is a culture at the New York Times where the editor says, this is the liberal slant I want on this story, and that's what you do. He says, not like that. But he said, it is a fact that most reporters in the New York Times newsroom are liberals, not conservatives. And so you have to worry whether that addiction does in fact influence what they write. So I think you have to, I think the New York Times' foreign reporting is very, very good. I see very little to find question within that. But I think you just, I have an occasional student, I say, where do you get your news? And they say, we get it from Jon Stewart. Well, I think I'd like to get a more reliable source than Jon Stewart, So I think by testing over a period of time what you're reading and finding whether it's credible, that's what I have for advice.
Other questions, please.
Hi, my name is Matt. I have a question regarding, so like your experience working, did you work for the Deseret News?
Yes.
Is that it? I was wondering what differences you saw catering more towards like a Utah or Mormon community versus the world, and if you had any special experiences doing so? Thank you.
Well, when I was at BYU, I was asked to do an assessment of the Deseret News, and I did. And I made quite a number of recommendations, and one of which the Deseret News was in the afternoon field at that stage, and it had to be in the morning field because afternoon papers were certainly going out of business. Now, little did I know that morning newspapers were also going out of business, but still. At the time, it seemed a good recommendation. But I said, and so you need to go head-to-head with the Trib, and you're a good paper, but there's some things you need to do to kind of shape up things a bit before you take on the Trib. And as sometimes happens, the chairman of the board of trustees said, well, you've made all these recommendations, why don't you come and be editor? And I said, well, I got some questions, and I told him what my questions were, and they said, well, you think better talk to President Hinckley about that. So I did talk to President Hinckley, and I said, President Hinckley, I know you're an extremely wise man, but might you not be making might be making a mistake by appointing the first non-Mormon editor to your church's newspaper? And he said, no, I've been at BYU before, some years by then. He said, no, you lived among us, you understand us, we trust you. How could you say no? Our second question was, well, what degree of independence would the editor of the paper have? And he said, well, we can't have old guys over here at the church headquarters telling you what to do. And never in my 10 years at the Des News did I get a edict to run or not to run a story. I was very irreverent because I said, well, it's going to take 3 or 4 years to do what we have to do with the Des News, and I have to have tenure at BYU. I love my faculty members, some of whom are sitting in the back. I love my students, some of whom are sitting over there. You know, I don't know what the rules are about. He said, leave of absence. And I said, I don't know what the leaves of absence are down there at BYU. And he looked at me and he smiled and he said, I have some influence down there. So I went to the Des News and we ran into a very, very tough opposition from the Tribune, a very difficult lawsuit in which they tried everything they could to stop us going morning. But it all went well, and I came back to BYU. It was a good experience. It was a tough thing, and all the time when we met with President Hinckley, he would say, "I know you guys are in deep water, but it's going to be all right. You're going to come out in the end. It's going to be right," and it was. So, was that the question you asked? How different was it? What? Yeah, it wasn't any different at all. I never got. In fact, I'll give you a little illustration. When I was at the Christian Science Monitor, they said, well, the only thing we want to see is the editorials before they run. And we sent that across to a board of directors of the church. And occasionally there'd be a little question about so forth. When I came to the Desert News, the situation was identical. We sent the editorial writers over to an appointed member of the 12. And after 6 months, President Hinckley said, don't bother sending them over again. Whereas actually when I was at the Christian Science Monitor, I always did keep sending them over. So that's what happened to there. So it was an amazingly similar situation. I found it a wonderful experience.
Any other questions? If not, please join me in thanking Professor John Hughes.